Thank you very much for those kind words. People often say when they invite me and I come that they're grateful that I've found time in my busy schedule, and it is a busy schedule, but I'm doing my very best to get around as often as I can and say yes as often as I can to all the different groups in the Archdiocese who ask me to be with them. When I was, as we've just heard, when I was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, a couple of times I spoke at the summer school for the Legion of Mary there. And as a parish priest in Victoria Park, I was involved in the local group of the Legion of Mary in that parish. The Legion of Mary is a wonderful organisation, and I'm very happy to be able to be here to share something with you about St John Bosco, but also simply by my presence and my words to assure you of my gratitude to you all for what you do in the Archdiocese, gratitude to you for your prayerful support. As we've just heard, I certainly need people's prayers. I don't think I'd still be going if I wasn't carried by the prayers of so many people in the Archdiocese. In fact, yesterday I wrote to Sister Deborah, the prioress at the Carmelite convent, to thank her for her promise and the community's promise of prayers for me, and in particular in relationship to the Plenary Council. I'm not here to talk about the Plenary Council, and I won't do that, but I'll just say that this is probably one of the most important things that the Church has done, perhaps in the last 100 years. The Plenary Council, the last one we had, was in 1937. So they're very rare, they're very significant in the life of a local church. And when I say local church, I mean our church here in Australia. And we certainly need the prayers of everybody. We're asking people to reflect on a fundamental question, and I think people like yourselves, I would really want to encourage to be involved in this. Don't sit back and just leave it for the others, because there's a danger, you know the old saying, the squeaky wheel makes the most noise. We need to hear everybody. The question we're asking, and it's not a question that we're doing like a survey, to find out the majority opinion. It's a question that we're asking people to think deeply about and reflect deeply about and talk to each other about and pray about, so that when the bishops come together, which is what a plenary council is really designed to do, we'll be able to have heard everybody and hopefully through listening to everybody hear the voice of the Spirit of God speaking through those many voices. So the question that you'll hear over and over again over the next many years is, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? And by us we mean the Church. Every single one of us has a right to share what we have discerned is necessary for us to be the Church more than we are already, that the Lord wants us to be. So please keep it in your prayers, and please support all of us who are involved in it. I was chosen by the Australian bishops to be the president of the Plenary Council, and that was approved by the Holy Father some months ago. And I've also been elected by the bishops to be the chair of the Commission of Bishops, which are overseeing the Plenary Council. So luckily I had nothing else to do. So anyway, I'm not here to talk about that, but it is important that I just share those thoughts with you. I've been asked to say a few words about the Year of Youth and St John Bosco. I'm not going to talk about St John Bosco much. I'm going to talk about Don Bosco, because he is a saint, of course. He was canonised in 1937, I think it was, one of the very few saints in the history of the Church to be canonised on Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday is the most important year in the Church's calendar, and Don Bosco was canonised on Easter Sunday. But Salesians, because we feel so close to him, find the title St John Bosco just a bit formal. And ever since the first Salesians lived with him, everyone's just called him Don Bosco. So I'm not being disrespectful, but I feel more comfortable because I'm a Salesian talking about him as Don Bosco. I do need to point out that that doesn't mean his name was Donald. His name was John. Don is the title in Italy that is given to priests. So, Don Bosco. So I was asked to talk about Don Bosco in relationship to the Year of Youth, and I'm not going to try and focus directly on the Year of Youth, but rather on the spirit of Don Bosco, the story of Don Bosco, and what this might help us to see in terms of how we as a church can welcome the young people of our church into the life of the church more fully. That's really what I wanted to talk about this morning. And to do that, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about his childhood and then reading to you one of his famous dreams. Many of you will know that Don Bosco is famous for all the dreams that he had. Some people get very interested in his dreams, and they are very interesting. They're not the heart of his life. The heart of his life is his mission and his spirituality. So that's what we should focus on, but the dreams can help us understand that. So I want to share the first significant dream that he had when he was 9 years old, then talk a little bit about him and finish up with another dream that he had right towards the end of his life. And I think you'll see the connection between the two. Don Bosco grew up in what today we would probably call a dysfunctional family. He certainly grew up in a family with difficulties. His father died when he was just 2 years old. One of Don Bosco's earliest memories is of his mother taking him to see the body of his father and saying to him, "You now have no father." And as we think about the life of Don Bosco as it unfolds, I think we see just how significant, in a sense, the loss of his father was. Because it made him do many things, but two things in particular. One was to turn to God as his father, which was what his mother encouraged him to do. His mother, by the way, Margaret Okiena Bosco, her name was, Mama Margaret, the Salesians call her, because that's what the boys in Don Bosco's school eventually called her. Mama Margaret's cause for canonisation has been introduced and is progressing at the moment through the various stages. So the first thing that, as Don Bosco, little John Bosco, grew up, was to turn to God as his father. But the other thing that's really interesting and which says a lot about him is that he also turned to the clergy, to the priests, looking for some fathering from them because he didn't have his own father. Unfortunately, with a couple of very significant exceptions, he didn't find that in the priests of his time. He would go up to them and he would greet them and he would try to engage them in conversation and be friendly with them. And in those days, priests were very aloof, thought that they were perhaps too important to be dealing with little grubby boys and all of that sort of thing. And so they would just sort of nod at him and walk on. That didn't turn him off God or the church or the priesthood. What it made him do was say to himself, I'm going to be a priest, and when I become a priest, I'm going to be the first to talk to young people. I won't even wait for them to come to me. I'll go and reach out to them. So see how something that was a great tragedy in his life, the loss of his father, was used by God to lead him into a deep sense of what the priesthood is all about. It's why we call priests father. What the priesthood is all about and what God was asking him to do. Today, we don't experience, at least not many of our priests, we don't experience them as so removed and so aloof and all the rest of it. But in Don Bosco's time, it was very unusual to find priests who were friendly and open and welcoming to young people. Don Bosco was lucky. He did find one or two and they played a key role in his life. I can't go into all the details of Don Bosco's life, so I can't tell you all of that. But generally speaking, the loss of his father led him to this deep conviction. When I grow up, I'm going to be a priest and I'll be the first to reach out to young people. He already started trying to do that as a little boy. And many of you will know the stories of Don Bosco, who spent hours and hours and hours teaching himself how to walk on a tightrope and how to be a juggler and all of these sorts of things. He had a fantastic memory as well. So what he would do would be go to Mass with his mother. He'd hear the sermon and he could remember it. He had an extraordinary memory. So he would come home and then he'd gather all the other young people in the village around him and he would put on a show for them, but it was on one condition. They could come to the show and watch him doing his tightrope walking and his juggling and his magic tricks, but they also had to listen to him repeat the sermon and then go to church. And it sort of captures the essence of Don Bosco's approach all through his life to religion. He never wanted to see religion as separate from the rest of life, or as something that had to be gloomy or oppressive or something like that. He wanted religion to be what it's exactly supposed to be, which is life-giving, making life better rather than worse, happier rather than more miserable, freer rather than more constricting. So this was very important to Don Bosco. That little bit of background might help you understand the importance of this dream that Don Bosco had when he was 9 years old. I'm reading it from a book called The Memoirs of the Oratory. This is actually written by Don Bosco himself. This is his kind of autobiography from when he was a little boy until not long after he started his work. It's a little bit long, but I think it's really important that you hear it. It's only a couple of pages. It was at that age, so at the age of 9, that I had a dream. All my life, this remained deeply impressed on my mind. In this dream, I seemed to be near my home in a fairly large yard. A crowd of children were playing there. Some were laughing, some were playing games, and quite a few were swearing. When I heard these evil words, I jumped immediately amongst them and tried to stop them by using my words and my fists. At that moment, a dignified man appeared, a nobly dressed adult. He wore a white cloak and his face shone so that I could not look directly at him. He called me by name, told me to take charge of these children, and added these words: "You will have to win over these friends of yours not by blows, but by gentleness and love. Start right away to teach them the ugliness of sin and the value of virtue." Confused and frightened, I replied that I was a poor, ignorant child. I was unable to talk to these youngsters about religion. At that moment, the children stopped their laughing, shouting and swearing. They gathered around the man who was speaking. Hardly knowing what I was saying, I asked, "Who are you, ordering me to do the impossible?" "Precisely because it seems impossible to you," he said, "you must make it possible through obedience and through the acquisition of knowledge." "Where? By what means can I acquire knowledge?" "I will give you a teacher. Under her guidance, you can become wise. Without her, all wisdom is foolishness." "But who are you to speak like this?" "I am the son of the woman whom your mother has taught you to greet 3 times a day. My mother tells me not to mix with people I don't know unless I have her permission. So tell me your name." "Ask my mother what my name is." At that moment, I saw a lady of stately appearance standing beside him. She was wearing a mantle that sparkled all over, as though covered with bright stars. Seeing from my questions and answers that I was more confused than ever, she beckoned me to approach her. She took me kindly by the hand and said, "Look." Glancing around, I realised that the youngsters had all apparently run away. A large number of goats, dogs, cats, bears and other animals had taken their place. "This is the field of your work," she said. "Make yourself humble, strong and energetic. And what you will see happening to these animals in a moment is what you must do for my children." I looked around again and where before I had seen wild animals, I now saw gentle lambs. They were all jumping and bleating as if to welcome that man and lady. At that point, still dreaming, I began crying. I begged the lady to speak so that I could understand her, because I did not know what all this could mean. She then placed her hand on my head and said, "In good time, you will understand everything." With that, a noise woke me up and everything disappeared. I was totally bewildered. My hands seemed to be sore from the blows I had given, and my face hurt from the blows I had received. The memory of the man and the lady and the things said and heard so occupied my mind that I could not get any more sleep that night. I wasted no time in telling all about my dream. I spoke first to my brothers, who laughed at the whole thing, then to my mother and my grandmother. Each one gave their own interpretation. My brother Joseph said, "You're going to become a keeper of goats, sheep and other animals." My mother commented, "Who knows? Maybe you'll become a priest." Anthony merely grunted. "Perhaps you'll become a robber chief," he said. But my grandmother, though she could not read or write, knew enough about theology and made the final judgment, saying, "Pay no attention to dreams." I agreed with my grandmother. However, I was unable to cast that dream out of my mind. The things I shall have to say later will give some meaning to all this. I kept quiet about these things, and my relatives paid little attention to them. But when I went to Rome in 1858 to speak to the Pope about the Salesian congregation, he asked me to tell him everything that had even the suggestion of the supernatural about it. It was only then, for the first time, that I said anything about this dream, which I had when I was 9 or 10 years old. The Pope ordered me to write out the dream in all its detail and to leave it as an encouragement to the sons of that congregation whose formation was the reason for my visit to Rome. Luckily, Don Bosco didn't follow the advice of his grandmother. He followed the advice of his mother instead. But the dream is a very beautiful dream and was really the first of a series of dreams that were part of Don Bosco's life and story right up until his death. One of the popes, I've forgotten which one it was now, once said that never in the history of the church had there been someone whose life had been so invaded by the supernatural as Don Bosco. One of the things about the dream, which I think is of interest to all of us here this morning, many things are of interest, but is the role that Mary assumes in that dream. Jesus appears first, tells Don Bosco what his mission is to be, and when Don Bosco is unsure and confused and doesn't know what to do next, what does the Lord do? He gives Mary to Don Bosco as mother and teacher. As will become very famous in the story of Don Bosco, as a helper. We just celebrated the feast or the solemnity of Mary, Help of Christians, who is the patroness of Australia. It's Don Bosco who is responsible largely for the spread of devotion to Mary under that title around the world. And the image of Mary that you'll often see, I have a great big copy of it hanging in my chapel at home, the image you'll see of Mary as the help of Christians, the original of it can be found in the Basilica of Mary, Help of Christians in Turin, in northern Italy, where Don Bosco had his work, and he was responsible for the building of that basilica and for that image. He didn't paint it himself, but he told the painter what he wanted. So Mary, right from the very beginning, played an important role in Don Bosco's life. And on a number of occasions throughout his life, he used to say, Mary has done everything. For Don Bosco, Mary was very much the mother of his family, his religious family, and she remains that way even to this day. I still get all of the international Salesian news which comes through on my email. And the Salesians are a very big presence all around the world, and so I've been reading over the last week or so all of these stories about how Mary Help of Christians was celebrated right across the world in the Salesian places. So Mary, as the Help of Christians in particular, is very important in the Salesian story, and of course very important in our Australian story, because the bishops at one of the plenary councils, I suspect, I'd have to check that, but they were the ones who very early on in our history of the church here in Australia made the decision to place us as a church under the patronage of Mary Help of Christians. I think the Salesians were very surprised when they arrived in Australia in the 1920s to find that the country was already dedicated to her. Don Bosco, I won't go through the whole details of his life. He had many, many difficulties in his journey towards the priesthood. His family was very poor, and in those days, of course, to become a diocesan priest, the family had to pay to send you to the seminary, and his mother just couldn't. So at one stage he thought he'd better join a religious order himself, so he was going to join the Franciscans. He had another dream, however, and in his dream he saw a group of Franciscan friars, and they were all running around like mad things, so distracted with things that they couldn't even stop to pray, and he worked out that God didn't want him to be a Franciscan. He eventually, through the great sacrifices of his mother, was able to go to the diocesan seminary and eventually was ordained a priest and started working in Turin. At first he started working in a big, really like a girls' boarding school for wealthy girls, because that was the way he could earn some money to make a living, and in his spare time he would visit the prisons where so many young people, particularly boys and young men, were imprisoned, because this was a time in Italy, as it was in many parts of the world, where the Industrial Revolution was just getting underway. Everyone was moving out of the country into the city. Many, many, many young people being exploited by their employers, not being treated properly, getting themselves into trouble, ending up in prison. Don Bosco used to go and visit them and try and help them. How did he actually begin this work that he then became famous for? If you ever go to Turin, I'm sure you'll go and visit Don Bosco's places, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the Basilica of Mary Help of Christians. But there's another little church in Turin which in one sense has got nothing to do with the Salesians. We don't run the church of St Francis of Assisi. But Don Bosco was there one day to celebrate Mass. The priest must have called him because he needed some help. It happened to be December the 8th, Feast of the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady. Don Bosco went into the sacristy to get ready for Mass, and there was a young boy, his name was Bartholomew Garelli, who was very poor, had no family, had no one to look after him, and he'd taken refuge in the sacristy because December in Italy isn't like December in Australia. It was the middle of winter. So this little boy in rags had taken refuge in the sacristy, and the sacristan, luckily we don't know his name because we shouldn't hold these things against people forever. The sacristan was a pretty tough sort of guy, and he was using a broomstick to beat this boy Bartholomew over the head and drive him out of the church, because what would a ragamuffin like that be doing in a sacristy when a priest was about to celebrate Mass? So Don Bosco saw this and he said to the sacristan, "Why are you treating one of my best friends so badly?" He'd never met the boy before, of course. "Why are you treating one of my best friends so badly?" So the sacristan was all embarrassed and said, "Oh, Don Bosco, I didn't know that you knew him. Of course, he's one of my best friends." So the sacristan left them alone. Don Bosco said to him, "What's your name?" Told him, "Bartholomew Garelli." "Where do you live?" "I don't have anywhere to live." "Where are your family?" "I don't have any family." All of that sort of thing. He said, "Can you read and write?" He said, "No." "Do you know how to say any prayers?" "No." So the boy's getting more and more downcast because every time Don Bosco asked him something, he had to say no. So then Don Bosco said, "Well, can you whistle?" And the boy said, "Oh, yes, I can whistle." So he said, "Show me how you whistle." So he showed him how to whistle. He said, "You can serve my Mass for me." The boy said, I've never served Mass before. He said, don't worry, I can help you. You can serve my Mass for me. And then at the end of Mass, Don Bosco got the little boy Bartholomew to kneel down in front of an image of Our Lady. He taught them the Hail Mary, and that was the beginning of Don Bosco's work for boys who had no one else to care for them. So you can see how for Don Bosco, his whole work was placed under the protection of Mary. And that remained the case for the rest of his life. It's why, for example, when he built the big basilica in Turin, which is at the heart of his work still today, he dedicated it to Mary, Help of Christians. You might also wonder, maybe you don't, perhaps never thought of it before, but why are Salesians, followers of Don Bosco, called Salesians? Why aren't they called Bosconians or something like that? Well, the answer is, when Don Bosco was getting his work up and running, he was looking for a patron, a saintly patron, to whom he could entrust the congregation and who could sort of offer a spirituality, a way of approaching our Christian faith. He chose St Francis de Sales. So you can see where Salesian comes from. It comes from the name of St Francis de Sales. And why did he choose St Francis de Sales? Because St Francis de Sales, who'd lived 200 or 300 years before, he became famous for many things, but especially for his gentleness and his kindness. St Francis de Sales was the Bishop of Geneva at the time of the Reformation. Now, Geneva was a centre of the Protestant Reformation. And so Francis, in fact, couldn't actually live in Geneva. He lived in northern Italy, which is why he was so popular in the area where Don Bosco grew up. But he was famous because, unlike so many others, he didn't approach the Protestants with anger or anything like that. He approached them with great gentleness and great loving kindness, and won many of them back to the Catholic faith. Don Bosco, I think, must have remembered the words of Jesus in his dream of 9 years old. It's not by blows, but by gentleness and kindness that you will win these young people for me. So Don Bosco thought, what better example to give my Salesians, my young men who are going to help me, than St Francis de Sales. Another interesting factor, just because what I'm trying to do partly is to help you see how important Mary was in the story of Don Bosco. One of the things that makes Don Bosco quite remarkable, there are many things, is the number of very holy young people that he formed in his school. And the outstanding one, of course, is Dominic Savio. Dominic Savio was a little boy who died just short of his 16th birthday, and he was, until the children from Fatima were canonised, so they've stolen the crown, but he was until then the youngest person ever to be canonised who hadn't died as a martyr. Jacinta and Francisco are now the two youngest. But it's a remarkable thing to think that these young people, whether we're talking about Jacinta and Francisco or we're talking about Dominic Savio, that these young people could be so strong in their faith, so deeply committed to their faith and so holy that they would be recognised as saints by the Church. Dominic Savio, amongst the many things he did at the school, was the leader, I suppose you'd call it, of a group of boys whom Don Bosco had created, a special group within the school. In those days we used to call them sodalities, and they belonged to this sodality that Don Bosco created, which was called, surprise, surprise, the Sodality of the Immaculate Conception. Don Bosco at first, in his devotion to Our Lady, focused on the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which links him, of course, to our archdiocese, because our archdiocese is dedicated to Our Lady's Immaculate Conception, as is our cathedral. But gradually Don Bosco moved not away from that, but decided to highlight Mary as the help of Christians. What time am I supposed to finish? When I like, okay. I don't want to keep you too long, but... So Dominic Savio is one example, and Don Bosco would say, Don Bosco wrote a number of books, biographies of his famous pupils. One is Dominic Savio, and that's why we know about him, but there are many others as well. And Don Bosco, at the end of his life of Dominic Savio, makes 2 points. One of them is, he says, Dominic was not the only holy young man in the school. In fact, there were others who were even holier. That's quite remarkable. I don't have time to tell you the story of Dominic Savio, but if you were to read his story, you'd be quite amazed at his story and probably think of your own children or grandchildren at the age of 15 and think, well, they were a bit different than Dominic Savio when they were growing up. The other thing Don Bosco used to say was, because he wrote these stories for the boys in his school, he used to say to them, if Dominic could do it, why can't you? If him, why not me? And as I have grown up in the Salesian world, as I get older, I think, well, I haven't even been able to manage it, and as you found out, because my secret was given away, I'll turn 65 next birthday. We need these great people like Dominic Savio, who's a wonderful example for the young, or Don Bosco, or so many other people. We need these people to remind us that holiness is possible. One of the things that changed the life of Dominic Savio was a little talk Don Bosco gave to his boys. He once said to them, God wants everyone to be a saint. And it's very easy. The first part was standard Christian teaching, of course. God wants us all to be saints. The second thing that Don Bosco said was a bit more surprising. The second thing was, if you do become a saint, there's a great reward waiting you in heaven. Well, that's also part of our traditional teaching. And the third thing Don Bosco said to the boys was, it's easy to be a saint. That's the part that we might find a little bit surprising. When Dominic Savio eventually, because a little boy, he didn't understand all of this. Once he'd heard that Don Bosco said everyone must become a saint, he started fasting and not having enough blankets on his bed at night and all of those penances and things, got very sick. And Don Bosco had to sit him down and say, now look, Dominic, what's going on? And Dominic said, well, you told us we had to become saints and this is the only way to be a saint. And Don Bosco said, no, you've misunderstood. It's easy to be a saint. To be a saint, all you have to do is do your best at whatever you're supposed to be doing at any given time. Now, we know that's not easy to do, but the idea is simple. So for Dominic Savio, it meant when you're in the church, give your heart and soul to your prayers. When you're in the classroom, do your best with your studies. When you're in the playground, throw yourself into all the games and have as much fun as you can. This was Don Bosco's recipe for holiness, and it produced someone like Dominic Savio. Reminds me of something that I was thinking I wanted to share with you this morning. I've been fortunate because of the role that I have and the way things have worked out in my life, pardon me, to travel a little bit, and I was fortunate enough as a young priest to spend 2 years living in Rome doing some studies. And so I got to visit places like Assisi and all of these famous places. Many of you will have been to the Basilica of St Francis in Assisi. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, a very deeply spiritual place. One of the things I remember, though, every time I've been there, because it's a very popular place, you walk through the Basilica having a look, and there's this recorded voice coming over the loudspeakers saying, "Silencio," silence. No one's allowed to talk, and that's fair enough in a church. You would never find that in the Basilica of Mary Help of Christians in Turin. And it's not to say one's better than the other, simply that the spiritualities are different. If you go to the Basilica in Turin, where Don Bosco is buried, where Dominic Savio is buried, where the foundress of the Salesian sisters, St Mary Mazzarello, is buried, if you go there, it's very prayerful inside the Basilica, but you step out the door and there are young people running around everywhere, kicking soccer balls and yelling and screaming and having a great time, because that's the life of young people, and Don Bosco wanted young people to be young people. And for us to give them the freedom to be young people and enjoy the gift of the life that God had given them. So if you're looking for a very holy, prayerful place in the traditional sense of the word. Probably Don Bosco's place in Turin might not be the best option. But if you want to see what spirituality for young people is all about, I don't think you can do better than to go there. It's still a thriving school, a thriving youth centre. There is young people everywhere. There's Salesians all over the place, Salesian sisters everywhere. It's a wonderful place to see this kind of spirituality that grew out of that dream that I spoke to you about in action. I better come towards the end because we'll be here forever. Once I get started, it's hard for me to stop. I said I wanted to finish by referring to another dream, and I'll do that now. I won't actually read it. I've got the whole text here, but it's a very long dream. It's contained in a letter that Don Bosco wrote to his Salesians. He was in Rome. I can't remember the year, but it was quite towards the end of his life. He died in 1888. I think it might have been 1886 that this letter was written. He was in Rome. Don Bosco lived at the time in Italy where there was a lot of tension between the government and the church. The papal states had been lost. There was a lot of anti-clericalism in many parts of Italy, particularly in the north where Don Bosco lived. And the Pope used to rely heavily on Don Bosco as a kind of a mediator between the church and the state. So Don Bosco was in Rome for meetings with the Pope about all of these sorts of issues. And one night he had a dream. And he decided after the dream to write a letter to the Salesians, and we actually have the whole dream written down at the end of our rule of life that the Salesians follow because it's so important for us. In this dream, two of Don Bosco's past pupils, who had been boys in the school in the early days, appeared to him in the dream. And they said to him, Don Bosco, would you like to know how things are going back in Turin? And Don Bosco, like any father, was missing his boys, missing his family, missing his home. He was very keen to get home. And so in the dream he said, I would love to know what's going on. So the two past people said, well, come with us. So in the dream, Don Bosco then found himself with these two, they're now men, walking through the playground. And I've been to that playground. I can picture exactly what he saw. Walking through the playground. And the boys were running around everywhere and again kicking soccer balls and all the rest of it. But there was something different. Some of the boys were huddled in little groups talking to each other and sort of checking no one was around. The Salesians were all there, but they were all standing on the sidelines watching the boys, making sure they behaved themselves. And the two young men in the dream said to Don Bosco, do you notice anything different from when you used to be here? And he said, everything looks all right, but there just doesn't seem to be that same spirit of joy and energy and enthusiasm that there used to be. And the two men said to him, well, you're right, there isn't. And Don Bosco said, why is that? What's going wrong? And then the two men said something to Don Bosco that got him quite upset. They said, it's because the Salesians don't love the boys as much as they used to. And Don Bosco kind of got a bit on the defensive and he said, what do you mean they don't love the boys as much as they used to? They've given their whole life to these boys. They're up before the boys are up, they get them up, they're with them all day long, all through the evening, they put them to bed, then they start their studies because they're trying to prepare for becoming priests. They're sacrificing these lives for these young people. What more could they possibly do? How better could they show that they love them? And then the two men said to Don Bosco, the best thing is missing. And Don Bosco said, what is the best thing that's missing? And the two young men said to Don Bosco, and this has become a famous saying for Salesians, and I personally think if you want to understand the Salesians and the way they go about things, all you need to remember is this phrase. They said, the best thing that's missing is this. It's not enough that the boys be loved. They have to know that they are loved. Like many great sayings. It's very simple, but it's very profound. I'll say it again. It's not enough that the boys be loved. In other words, these two men were saying to Don Bosco, it's not enough that these Salesians have given their lives to the boys and are sacrificing themselves for the boys, because they're not doing it in ways that make it clear to the boys that they are loved. Of course they love them, but maybe they're not showing it. And for Don Bosco, it was so important that the boys knew that they were loved. When it came time for Don Bosco's canonisation, a number of the boys who were by then old men would give evidence at the inquiry into whether or not Don Bosco should be canonised, and they all said the same thing. When I was at his school, I believed that I was his favourite. Everyone thought they were Don Bosco's favourite. Everybody. And what that means is that Don Bosco knew each of his boys so well that he knew how to make that boy feel special and cared for and loved without neglecting any of the others. Salesians used to think that was Don Bosco's educational method. That was the way Don Bosco, what Don Bosco left to us so that we would know how to educate boys properly. Over the last 20 or 30 years, maybe a bit longer, we've come to understand that it's more than that. It's actually Don Bosco's spirituality. Because when they say, those two young men said to Don Bosco in this dream, it's not enough that the boys be loved, they have to know that they are loved. What they were really saying to Don Bosco is the Salesians have to learn again how to love as Jesus loved. Because if you think of the Gospels, and so many of the stories in the Gospels, what they show us is that Jesus knew how to let different people know that they were loved in a way that would make sense to them. I could speak for hours on this, I won't, but let me just put into your mind a couple of ideas that you might take away with or pray over during the day. If you think of the story of the woman caught in adultery in St John's Gospel, whatever had been the story of this woman, the way John's Gospel tells this story, she is being treated abominably by the religious leaders. They drag her in front of the whole crowd. They throw her down on the ground in front of Jesus. They demand that she be stoned to death because that's what the law of Moses says. And of course they don't care about the woman at all because they're really wanting to get at Jesus because they're trying to undermine Jesus. The key question for us to reflect on is, how did Jesus react in this situation? Did he say to those religious leaders, how dare you speak to me like that? Don't you know who I am? Or how dare you be so rude and so unkind to this poor woman? Who do you think you are? Or he certainly didn't say, I better get myself out of here before I get myself into trouble. What did he do? He bent down, scribbled something on the ground, and it's almost as if he wanted to give these men a chance to come to their senses and realise what they were doing. It didn't work. They were still demanding that Jesus order this woman to be stoned to death because that's what the law of Moses said. So Jesus said to them, let the one who has no sin throw the first stone. But then he didn't kind of point at each one of them and make them feel guilty. He bent down again, started drawing in the ground. And this time it worked, and they all walked away one by one. And then he stands up, looks around, says to the woman, where have they gone? Hasn't anyone condemned you? And the woman says to him, no one's condemned me. And then what does he say? I don't condemn you either. Now go and sin no more. What possibly could have been more eloquent for this woman in her situation where she's been condemned by everybody and mistreated by everybody than to hear Jesus say to her at that moment, I don't condemn you. Do you think she could possibly have gone away from that encounter not knowing that she was loved? Jesus also said to her, now go and don't sin anymore. It wasn't as if he was making excuses for her or saying that what she'd been doing didn't matter. But what Jesus knew is that the only way she would actually be able to hear and take into her heart the second thing he said to her, go and don't sin anymore, was if he had first said to her out of the truth of his own heart, I don't condemn you. It wasn't enough that Jesus loved that woman. She had to know in a way that could speak to her that she was loved by him. And she did. I could give you so many examples of this from the Gospels, but I think even that one example might help you to see what I'm trying to say. That Don Bosco's approach isn't just how to work well with young people, how to be a good educator. Don Bosco's approach was about how to love as Jesus loved. And of course, that's not just a heritage that Don Bosco gives to Salesians. That's a heritage that Don Bosco and his Salesian family gives to the whole world, certainly to the whole church. Just as the Franciscans have left the church a wonderful insight into the importance of poverty in the life of a Christian. Just as the Benedictines have left to the whole church the importance of prayer, so Salesians, through Don Bosco, leave to the whole church the importance of loving as Jesus loved. I personally think that this is something that could speak to the heart of every parent as they think about their children, or of every teacher as they think about their pupils, or of every priest as he thinks about the people in his parish. It's for all of us. It's not enough that we love people. We have to do that. That's Jesus' command. But notice what Jesus' command actually says. Love one another as I have loved you. So this, I think, is the great gift of Don Bosco. It's a precious gift for the whole church during this year of youth. I think it's a precious gift for the whole church at any time. So this morning, as we think about this and as we reflect too on how Don Bosco was accompanied every step of the way by the presence of Mary as his mother and as his helper, we might pray that each of us can love those whom the Lord puts in our lives in ways that make it clear to them that they are loved, not condemned, not judged, not criticised, but loved. And when people are loved, then they learn how to love. Don Bosco used to say to the Salesians, because he always wanted them to be with the young people, if you learn to love what they love, then they will gradually learn to love what you love. And of course, what we love or try to love is the Lord and his church. So I think there's a lot here that we could all take away with us, perhaps carry with you partly through the rest of the day, pray about together as we celebrate Mass, that we can receive something of this spirit of Don Bosco, which, as I say, isn't just for the Salesian family, it's for the whole church. And if we can, then gradually the relationships in our families, in our parishes, in our communities, in our church will grow and develop and be healed. So I've gone on much longer than I was supposed to, so I do apologise for that. I think we're going to celebrate Mass shortly. So thank you very much for your attention. Please keep me in your prayers. As I said at the start, it's a big task ahead of me with the Plenary Council. But if I know that I've got the Archdiocese of Perth behind me, I'll be very confident that I can go ahead with great confidence. Also, of course, with the presence and prayers of Mary as our mother. So thanks very much, everyone. Oh, thank you. Oh, it's Richmond. Thank you very much. As a good Salesian, Don Bosco would want me to acknowledge how important sport and fun and all of those things are. So I'm very happy to receive a bottle of wine that has the Richmond logo on it. Thanks very much.